Hello guys, welcome back to Mr. Deep Coding channel. My name is Patrick and this is episode 17 of the Kotlin Multiplatform social media app series. In today's episode, we will be writing the short code to handle the profile screen so you can use it across both Android and iOS. We will cover everything from creating data transfer objects to setting up repositories, use cases, and integrating with our existing services. Let's get started. Alright, our first step will be to define the data transfer objects. Inside the common main directory of the shared module, come here at the root package level, and I'm going to create first of all a new directory. I will name this one as account. Now you can add a / to create a nested directory. So I'll create the data and then the model directory. Now inside this model directory, I'm going to create a new Kotlin file that I'm going to name as profile model. This is where we will define our data transfer object for the profile feature. First, we will define the remote profile data class. This class represents the profile data we will receive from our remote server. It contains the ID, the name, the bio, the image URL, followers count, following count, is following, and is own profile. Note here that we annotated the class with @serializable. This is to enable serialization and deserialization of the data. Now, next, let's look at profile API response data. This class models the response we get from our profile endpoint. It contains 3 fields: success, which indicate whether the API call was successful; profile, which holds the profile data if the call was successful; and message, which contains an error message if the call failed. Lastly, to include the HTTP status code, we are going to define another model, profile API response, that has this data, which represent the profile API response data, and then the code for the HTTP status code. All right, that's it for the remote profile models.kt. Next, we will move on to creating the account API service class, which will handle the communication with our remote server. Now right-click on the data directory and let's create a new Kotlin file named account API service. In here, we are going to define an internal class account API service that should extend the Ktor API class. For now, we will define only one method called a getProfile that returns an instance of profile API response. The getProfile method has 3 fields: token. Now this is used to authenticate the request. We have profile ID, the ID of the profile we want to retrieve, and current user ID, the ID of the current user making the request. This is useful to determine if the current user is following the profile or it's their own profile. For the body of getProfile method, we first of all going to use client.get. Let's import this get. This is to make a get request to our server, and we store the returned response inside an HTTP response val. Here we set the endpoint to fetch the profile with the specified profile ID. Then we need to add this query parameter for the current user ID. And lastly, we set the token. Now, after obtaining the HTTP response, we return a new instance of profile API response. And for the code, we call HTTP response.status. For the data, we need to call HTTP response.body. Now import this body method. For now, that's it for the account API service class. Next, we will define the profile repository interface and its implementation class. In the account directory, let's create another directory. We will call it domain. Now add a / to create a nested directory, and this one we call it as repository. Before we create the repository interface, let's create the profile domain model, and we're going to put that inside a new directory named model. Right-click on the domain directory and let's create model. Now inside this model directory, we will create a new Kotlin file. We will name it as profile. Now here we have our data class profile that has pretty much the same attribute as what we have inside the profile remote model. Now coming back inside the repository directory, Here we're going to create the profile repository interface. Select interface and hit enter. Now in the profile repository interface, we are going to define for now just a single method called getProfile, which takes a profile ID and returns a flow of type result of type profile. Now this allows us to asynchronously fetch profile data and handle it reactively. Next, we'll provide an implementation for the profile repository interface. All right, now come here on the data directory and let's create a new directory. We are going to name it as repository. Inside this new repository directory, we are going to create a new Kotlin file class that we will name as profile repository implementation. Now here we need to define a new internal class, profile repository impl, that should extend the profile repository interface. In the constructor, we'll have three dependencies: account API service, an instance of account API service to make network request. We also have preferences, an instance of user preferences to manage user data locally for the current user. And lastly, we have dispatcher, an instance of dispatcher provider to manage coroutine dispatchers. Now, of course, here we need to override the getProfile method. Since this method returns a flow of type result of type profile, here we're going to return and call the flow builder function. Inside this flow builder, we first of all get the user data by using preferences.getUserData. Then if the profile ID matches the current user ID, we emit a success result with the user own profile data. Now in the border directory of the data directory, we are going to create mappers.kt file where we will define this to domain profile function to map user settings to profile. So create a new Kotlin file class named mappers. Inside this mappers.kt, we first define this extension function to domain profile on user settings to convert user settings to profile. For the is following, we'll pass false, and for is own profile, we're going to pass true. Let's also create another extension function, this time on profile, to convert a profile to user settings. And for this to user settings, we'll need to take the token. Now close mappers.kt, and coming back inside repository implementation, we need to import this to the main profile. Then below this if condition, we are going to make an network request calling API account API service.getProfile to fetch the profile data. Then we handle the response based on the status code. If the response is successful, http status code.ok. We convert the remote profile to profile. Don't worry, we're going to create this method in a moment. And then we emit a success result. We don't forget that if the profile ID equals userdata.id, we also need to update the user data in preferences. Then if the response is not successful, we emit an error result with the error message from the API. Now let's go inside profile remote models.kt, and here we are going to define this to profile method that converts remote profile to profile. We can now come back inside profile repository implementation, and we also need to import here to user settings. Now on the return flow right here, we are going to use the catch operator to handle any exception that may occur during the flow. And if there was an error, we are going to emit an error result with the exception message. Then we will use flow on dispatcher.io to ensure that the upstream flow operates on the IO dispatcher. So that's how our profile repository implementation class works. This repository abstracts the details of fetching profile data and handles both local and remote sources. Next, we will define the getProfile use case class, which will use the repository to fetch profile data. Now let's come back inside a domain directory and create a new directory named use case. In this use case directory, we are going to create getProfile use case. And in here, we will define a getProfile use case class that should implement coin component. This is to allow us to inject the repository directly here inside getProfile use case. We call byInject to inject profile repository. The invoke operator function allows us to call a getProfile use case as if it were a function. It takes the profile ID and returns flow of result of profile by delegating repository.getProfile methods. Next, let's open post API service class. We'll go here inside common, then direct data, then remote, and open post API service class. We will extend this class by adding the getUserPost method. This method will fetch posts for a given user. Now below this dislike post method, here is the code for the getUserPost. This method takes 5 parameters. The token, this is the authentication token for the request, user ID, the ID of the user whose post we want to fetch, current user, the ID of the current user making the request, page, the page number for pagination, and page size, the number of posts per page. It returns post API response, and then inside the body, we first of all use client.get to make a GET request. Now here we are setting the endpoint to fetch post for the specific user ID. We then set query parameters for the current user ID, the page, and the page size. We also set the token for authenticating the request. After we obtain the HTTP response, we return post API response, which includes the status code and the response body. Next, let's add the getUserPost method to the post repository interface and its implementation class. So we will go inside the post directory, then open the domain directory. Now below like or dislike post method, we have the getUserPost, which takes the user ID, page, and page size and returns result of list of posts. Now we need to go inside post repository implementation and override this newly added method. Now before we write the implementation code, let's define a private method named fetchPost. This private method will abstract the common logic for fetching post. It takes an API called lambda, which performs the API request. This method should return result of list of posts. In the body, this method runs in the IO dispatcher context using withContextDispatcher.io, and we need to return from that. Then we need to put our logic inside a try block. Here we first retrieve the current user data from user preferences. Then we make the API call by calling API call and passing in current user data. We store that inside API response. We will handle the response based on the status code. If the API call is successful, meaning HTTP status code.OK, we map the received remote post to domain post and return a success result. If there is an error, we return an error result with the appropriate message. So here we just say unexpected error. If we catch an IO exception, we will tell the user that they may have internet issues, or for whatever throwable that we may catch, we are just going to return result error, passing in exception.cause. Now, coming back in the getUserPost method, here we need to return and call fetchPost. For the API call, we will define this new lambda and call post API service.getUserPost, to which we need to pass the token, the user ID, the current user ID, the page, and the page size. We will also go inside fetch feed post, this method here, and we need to make use of this fetch post method. So we will remove this code and instead return and call fetch post. For the API call, we are going to define this lambda and use post API service.getFeedPost instead. This method expects the user token, the current user ID, the page, and also the page size. Next, we need to define the getUserPost use case. So let's go inside a use case directory In here, we are going to create a new Kotlin file that we will name as getUserPostUseCase. We will define a new class getUserPostUseCase that need to implement coin component so that we can inject the post repository in this repository property. We need to override the operator invoke function, which takes the page size, and the user ID, and returns result of list of posts. It delegates that to repository.getUserPost method. Finally, let's configure our coin modules to provide dependencies for all the new components we have added. So expand the DI package and open shared modules.get. Now, right below follows module, we will need to define here another module, the account module, and we need to provide the account API service, the get profile use case, and also profile a repository. Then in the post module, we also need to provide the get user post use case. Now, of course, we need to add this account module in the return list of shared modules. Alright, that concludes today's episode. We have defined our DTOs, created services and repositories, added use cases, and configured our dependencies. In the next episode, we will continue building on the profile feature and add the presentation layer code. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon to get notified when the next video is up. As for now, happy coding!